Welcome. Thank you for your interest in voter protection. Last March, Greg Meyer, the recruitment chair for the North Carolina Democratic House Caucus, announced that Democratic candidates have filed for all 120 House seats. A day later, it was announced that Democratic candidates have filed for all 50 North Carolina Senate seats. This is exciting and unprecedented. Our job as party leaders, precinct leaders, activists, and volunteers is to elect those Democrats. A voter protection program can help, and we need every advantage as we work to create a big blue wave this November. So thanks again for your interest in voter protection. I'm Jack Sanders. Just a little background on myself. I'm a longtime Democratic volunteer. I was the chair in Orange County from 2005 to 2009, during which time we helped elect Barack Obama president. I have experience in a greeter program and a voter protection program because we had those programs in place while I was the chair. So most of this material is based on my experience with both of those programs. We have, for tech support, we have Eli Hayes, and we have manning the chat box for us here, Jenny McMillan. Please type into the chat room and let us know your name and your county. You can also communicate with us via the chat room. As far as questions go, we may not be able to answer them as they arise, but feel free to type the questions in as you think of them, and Jenny, monitoring the chat room, will pass me the questions and I will answer them throughout the webinar as I have time to do that, and if I, in fact, know the answer. You should have received a link for the handouts for this presentation. There are 5 items on the list of handouts. One is the slides. There are 2 North Carolina Voters' Bill of Rights, one in English and one in Spanish. There is a small document of the threats to voters' rights, and there's another document called Planning for Voter Protection. It's a supplementary document to the protection. Everything I know about voter protection is in that particular document. So if you don't take enough notes and you feel like you're missing something, just print out a copy of that particular Planning for Voter Protection document and it will be there. The purpose of this presentation is to present an overview first of voter protection, and then secondly, after the overview, describe how a county party can organize for effective voter protection. When we finish, you should understand the essentials of voter protection and have a good idea about how to organize your county party for voter protection. You already know 90% of what you need to know. This presentation is just going to put some of the pieces together in a way that makes voter protection straightforward for your county party. The target audience is county party leaders, party officers, precinct officers, other party leaders, most specifically those party members who will provide the leadership in organizing a voter protection program. This presentation may also be of interest to volunteers who can always benefit from understanding the big picture. This next slide was really aimed at an in-person presentation where there could be some discussion, and we're not going to have that discussion. But online, I would like you to answer that question in the chat box. So if you would give your county and say yes or no to the first question, were threats observed in 2016 or 2017 in your county? I'd like to get sort of a count of how many counties actually had problems. And if you want to include a little information about what they were, such as, for example, poorly trained polling officials or malfunction of election equipment, just to let me know. Secondly, the last bullet there, let me say what I think is expected in 2018 regarding voter protection. First, more action from the General Assembly to suppress the vote. And in the last 2 months, we've seen a lot of that. Unfortunately, I expect there's going to be some of that at the local level, because we have now, for boards of elections, they are four-member boards, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, a clear recipe for gridlock, which means if problems arise with ballot access, it may well be difficult to actually resolve those problems due to that gridlock. Taking their cue from the president and from the General Assembly, I expect there are going to be other efforts from people that think in this time of heightened partisanship that they need to attack our election processes. I really think things are not getting better as far as voter protection goes. I think they're getting worse. We need to be prepared. Voter protection, first, is protecting the right to vote, which is a fundamental right of citizens of this country, a pillar of our democratic system of government. There are some citizens that don't have that right to vote, and you can think of them: people that are less than 18, felons in prison or still on probation or parole, unregistered citizens. Some unregistered citizens just never get around to it. Some are unable to register because of barriers placed in their way that makes it very difficult for them to register. Those are the sorts of citizens that we need to protect their right, to reduce the barriers to registration. Having the right to vote is not sufficient. We also need free, fair, and accessible elections. By free elections, I mean there's no intimidation, no pressure to vote in a particular way. The voter should not be pressured by an employer or a boss or a union leader or a church leader or a political machine or a landlord or the KKK or your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend. There should be no pressure. An important aspect of that is a secret ballot where you get to vote on your own. Nobody else gets to see it. A fair election would be an election where everyone in every community has an equal opportunity to elect our representatives and other officials, as opposed to, which is what is being aimed at by some parts of our political society, an entrenched minority that monopolizes the powers of government by control of the electoral processes. By accessible, I mean there are no barriers to registration, such as burdensome documentation requirements, or on election day, long lines, malfunctioning equipment, remote poll locations, and so on. Lastly, accurate counting and reporting is important and necessary for a fair election. Compared to voter fraud, election fraud perpetrated during the vote counting and reporting can be orders of magnitude greater than voter fraud. We actually have adequate safeguards against voter fraud. Voter protection has become a major issue in North Carolina and also across the country. We need to stay on top of it. We need to fight to resist the impulse toward voter suppression, which we see so prevalent in our General Assembly and in a number of other states, and even in our national government. Voter protection is important because the right to vote is fundamental to our democratic system of government. There's no more fundamental right than the right to vote. The U.S. Supreme Court noted long ago that the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. Fair elections instill confidence. They instill confidence in the election results, therefore in the legitimacy of our elected officials and in the legitimacy of our government. These things contribute to a united citizenry and contribute to the strength and well-being of our country. Fair elections also encourage civic participation. If elections are not fair, if they are perceived to be rigged, if voting is suppressed, particularly when suppression appears aimed at certain demographic, ethnic, or economic groups, certain people that are suppressed feel cheated, angry, and frustrated. This results in a weaker country, less able to deal with internal problems, yes, less unified, and capable against an external threat. This is a list of some of the active players in voter protection. There are some others. I'm going to talk about a few of these, but not all. As far as elected official goes, you know, the legislature makes the laws regarding elections. The executive branch enforces those laws and conducts the elections, and the judges rule in cases that come before them about election law. As far as election officials go, I want to focus on the county level. There is a state board of elections and a state director of elections, and they set policy at the state level. At the county level, which is our focus tonight, there is a board of elections, and as I mentioned, it's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, which is not good. It didn't used to be that way. And they hire a director of elections, a very important person for the local elections, and a person with whom your county chair should have a relationship. It's an important relationship between the county chair and the director of elections. The director of elections locates and prepares polling places, hires and trains the poll workers, prepares the machinery and the ballots, and conducts a fair, one hopes, a fair election. The care and the sense of responsibility with which the director of elections oversees the elections has a major impact on the proper conduct and the fairness of the election. And it's important to be able to communicate with that director in order to address any sorts of problems with the responsibilities that BOE director has. There are political parties, all of which at all levels are involved in one way or another in voter protection at the national level, at the state level, and at the county level. We're focused on the county level. So there's the county party chair and the other party officers and the precinct chairs and officers. And they are very much involved in, or can be very much involved in voter protection. There are a couple of civic organizations I want to mention because they do such a good job and provide resources to party organizations. In particular, first, the Democracy NC. And you can get to Democracy NC at democracync.org. They have lots of information about voter protection that you can download or just read online. Another very good source for information about voter protection is the Brennan Center for Justice. And those civic organizations, they do research, they make policy proposals, they participate in advocacy, education, litigation, communication. They're an important set of players in voter protection. Lastly, voters are important. They need to be educated. They need to know their voting rights, and they need to know how to assert their rights and how to report problems if they see them. Voters need to register, vote, report any problems that they see, participate in the struggle to maintain free and fair elections, call their local officials to register their views, volunteer. They are very important. Let's see. There are some other players, malicious groups and persons, intimidators, misinformants, foreign governments, corporations, the media, unions, political machines, special interests, the KKK. They're all playing their role, some beneficial and some contrary to beneficial, trying to suppress the vote and warp our democracy. Voters need to know the voting rights in North Carolina. This is a list of some of the more important ones. The handout, two of the handouts that that are available with this presentation have the North Carolina Voters Bill of Rights, a very good list put out by Democracy NC in English or Spanish. But these particular rights were put in jeopardy just 5 years ago with when the General Assembly passed a very bad bill making it, actually they were curtailing these rights. These rights are to vote without an ID. They wanted to disallow that, to require voters to have ID. They wanted to get rid of same-day registration, which now remains a right. They wanted to get rid of out-of-precinct voting, which is something that people can do on election day, and they can vote a provisional ballot. So we still have the right to vote out of precinct and vote a provisional ballot if you end up at the wrong polling place, and to vote without intimidation. One of the things that law did that remains in place is that they allowed an additional set of what I call free range poll observers. These are free range in the sense that they can rove around the county and drop in on the polling places just to see how things are going. I believe the reason behind that they would have claimed is to prevent voter fraud, but in fact, in my view, they wanted to enhance the ability of people to make challenges to voters and thereby to try to intimidate more voters. These rights are subject to change. There are 6 constitutional amendments on the ballot, unless there's a court decision here very quickly. 2 of those amendments deal directly with voting rights in North Carolina. I will get to those amendments on a later chart, but they, in particular, that first right on this chart, to vote without an ID, that particular right is in jeopardy due to this constitutional amendment. Who needs to know the rights? The voters particularly, greeters and poll observers, monitors, poll workers, basically everybody needs to know what these rights are. And how can we accomplish that? Basically through voter education, through greeter training and poll observer training, through poll worker training. That's something that the county party can do as part of their voter protection program. And we will get to all of that in time here. This is a list, this next chart is a list of the local threats. I'm not going to go into any great detail here, but these are local threats. By local, I mean they are amenable to being addressed at the county level. And the county party is well positioned to address these problems. One can think about the notion of prevention versus cure when it comes to voter protection. A lot of these problems, like problems with ballots, voting equipment or machines, problems with the poll workers, problems with the polling places, those can be addressed ahead of time. You can address these problems in a preventive manner by working with your director, your BOE director, and something that needs to happen. You can also work with your Board of Elections directly, and you can work with your legislators and your county commissioners if, for example, more funds need to be allocated in order to have fully functioning and sufficient polling machinery. This next chart is a list of systemic threats. These are things that are done at a higher level, above our pay grade here at the county, like national laws or state laws that erect barriers to registration and voting, or insufficient funding of elections at the state and national levels, or unfair administrative procedures, which may result in purges of voter rolls. Actually, now that I think about it, that is something that can be handled to some extent at a county level. You can ask your director of elections what the purge procedures are and see whether or not they jeopardize people's right to votes. And there have been some recent developments. In fact, there are developments today and developments on Monday, and I'm going to talk about the ones that I think are most important. I had a real whirlwind task of trying to keep this particular slide up to date because it's been changing so quickly in the past few days. But this first bullet, all of our state congressional districts were declared unconstitutionally partisan by a 3-judge panel of the 4th District Court. This happened on Monday. The panel ordered new district maps for 2018. That's going to be a very difficult thing to do, but it's still in the courts. They have called for hearings tomorrow, or briefs submitted to the panel tomorrow in order to talk about whether they can actually get this done in 2018 and who should create the new district maps. The state legislature that drew up the unconstitutionally partisan maps, or perhaps a special master that the court hires. The second bullet has to do with a voter photo ID. This was done, that's on the ballot. That was done by our General Assembly on June the 29th of this year. And it does what it says. It will require every voter that votes in person to have a photo ID. Now, one of the aspects of this particular amendment referendum is they didn't say in the amendment what the acceptable photo IDs will be, which will leave it up to the General Assembly to determine what the acceptable photo IDs will be. Here is a quick pop quiz. It's one question, multiple choice. The question is, how do you think the General Assembly justified this particular amendment? Answer A, to prevent voter fraud, or answer B, to suppress the vote among constituents that will tend to vote Democratic. You don't need to answer, but I think I've probably indicated what I expect it to be. On the Democracy North Carolina website, I saw that they were estimating 200,000 voters would be denied ballot access as a result of that constitutional amendment if it passes. Item 3 here is a change in the composition of the Board of Elections. This started a couple of years ago, right after Governor Cooper was elected. They decided that we needed the General Assembly decided a different change in composition of the boards of elections. So right now what we have, after several laws and court challenges, we have at the county level 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, which leads to gridlock and is really not an effective way to run elections. At the state level, we have a 9-member board, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and an independent. And these all get appointed by the governor based on submissions to the governor to select from. There has been another constitutional amendment proposed on the ballot this fall, giving the General Assembly the power to appoint an 8-member board, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. This is something that we need to educate our voters about, to vote no on these constitutional amendments. This next thing has to do with early voting hours. They were changed by a law passed in June to make the hours uniform during the week from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., uniform on Saturdays, uniform on Sundays across all the early voting sites. They eliminated the popular last Saturday because, in fact, a lot of Democratic voters, in particular a lot of churches, got their voters to the polls on that last Saturday. There was such a hue and outcry that a subsequent law just a few days later restored that popular last Saturday for 2018 only. So we will have that same problem again in 2019 and more particularly in 2020. This next item was Legislative districts that were declared unconstitutional, 28 of them. This happened in 2017. New maps are in place for 2018 for that. And lastly, the horrible law passed in 2018 that removed a number of our voting rights, that was declared unconstitutional by the failure of the U.S. Supreme Court to overrule a district court that had declared it unconstitutional. So that happened just last year, that law was overturned. Despite these adverse court rulings, the Republican-dominated General Assembly is still considering other measures that will accomplish their vote suppression objectives. Stay tuned. We're now getting into the actual operational aspects of voter protection at the county level. This is the fundamental triangle of voter protection at the county level. We have at the bottom the polling place. You're all familiar with this particular chart, this slide here, this triangle. At the bottom, we have the polling place. In the polling places, there are the poll workers. That would be the chief judge, 2 assistant judges, other clerical staff, and the voting equipment. And there may be and can be party-designated poll observers. Outside the polling place, there can be greeters whose role is to greet the voters, hand them a sample ballot, a marked sample ballot, assist them if they need assistance. They also have a role to play in voter protection, an important role, which I will mention in just a minute. The voters come, they pass by the greeters, they go into the polling place, vote, they come back out, they pass by the greeters again, and here's what can happen. The greeters, the role of the greeters is they can, in voter protection, they can observe and monitor the area for problems, and they can then report those problems to a problem response team that the party would set up. In this chart, this slide, I have represented the problem response team in the upper left corner there as the county chair and the party lawyer. The problem response team will typically include the county chair. The county chair will want to be involved, want to be in the loop if there are voting problems during either early voting or on election day. So the greeter's role is to monitor outside, and if they talk to voters and voters come out and say, I was not allowed to vote a provisional ballot, that is a voting irregularity. Any voter is eligible to request and vote a provisional ballot. But the role of the greeter at that point is they can advise the voter to go back in and talk to the chief judge rather than just a clerical worker. Or they can call the problem response team, call the county chair, who can then call the director of elections, who can then call down to the polling place and get that particular problem resolved. The sides of the triangle represent relationships and lines of communications between the polling place and for example, the observers and greeters in the polling place and the county chair, or the relationship between the county chair and the director of elections, that important relationship that I mentioned, and then the oversight, set up an oversight relationship between the director of elections and the polling place. The director of elections who selected that polling place, prepared the equipment, and so on. So those relationships are very important. During a if there is a problem, this is the way it might go. There might be a problem that the greeter observes, calls the county chair, calls the director of elections, and then back down to the polling place. The essence of voter protection at the county level is strengthening this triangle, strengthening the vertices and strengthening the sides from the voter perspective, from a voter protection perspective. The tactics that you can use to do that are on this next slide. So this is a list of tactics that the county party can use for voter protection. You can choose to use all of them or none, I suppose, But if you're going to do voter protection, these are the ones that we in Orange County have found most effective. First of all, educate the voters. Make sure they understand their rights. Make sure they know how to report problems. Empower them to demand their rights, because a knowledgeable voter is an empowered voter, is much more likely to assert his or her rights or to report a problem. On a later slide, I will talk about things you can do to educate voters. Also this year, because we have constitutional amendments on the ballot that relate directly to voter protection, you need to educate the voters about those constitutional amendments. Secondly, the county chair gets to nominate BOE members and can nominate precinct judges. So the tactic is nominate good, responsible people that understand the gravity of the position. You can also ask your precinct chairs for recommendations about good precinct judges if as a chair you feel like you need to get more volunteers who are knowledgeable or interested in being precinct judges. This third item is work with election officials, and this is that relationship that I think is important between the chair and the director of the Board of Elections. So what you can do is set up a meeting between the chair and the first vice chair, or whoever else the chair might like to have accompany to this meeting, with the director of elections, and discuss such things as the suitability of polling places, any past problems and how they can be avoided this time, the plans for early voting, the number and locations of the sites, the hours of operations, and so on. Establishing this relation can strengthen the polling places, because the director of election understands that the county party is actually quite interested in fair elections, and therefore may be incentivized to make sure that things are better organized. And it also will pay off if during the election a problem arises. I think it's much better for a county chair who has a relationship with the director of elections to make that call, rather than to have the director of elections talk to a county chair for the first time when there's some problem on election day. This third bullet is to use poll observers to monitor inside. They can observe discreetly. They can report problems if the chief judge will allow them to make a phone call, which is not always the case. But they can observe the elections. They can discreetly talk to the chief judge if they observe some irregularity. So that's a way to protect inside the polling place. Training is required for poll observers because there are rules and regulations about how they have to behave. Use greeters outside. They have a very important role in greeting the voters, and the opportunity to put a marked sample ballot in the hand of the voter just as he or she is about to enter the polling place should not be missed. But they also have their voter protection responsibilities, which is to monitor the problems, monitor outside for problems, and to report those problems to the problem response team, probably the county chair. Again, training is required. You need to be trained for being a greeter, and you also need to have, as part of that training, how to observe for problems and how to report problems. Then lastly, respond quickly to problems. If you delay on the problems, some people may not get to vote if the problem persists. A tiered approach works well. That is, if it's a relatively simple problem, if, for example, a greeter observes some Republican candidate worker infringing in the restricted area, the greeter can go point out to that worker that there is a restricted area and they shouldn't be inside that restricted area. So a greeter may be able to handle a problem, or may be able to counsel the voter directly who reports a problem as to what they can do. Or they may need to call the problem response team, which they can do if they have the number of the chair, for example. Or if that's not sufficient, if it's a complicated legal problem, the county chair can talk to the director of elections, but more serious problems may require a call to some extra legal support. The North Carolina Democratic Party has said it's going to set up a hotline and legal team operation for the 2018 elections. So you should be aware that the NCDP is going to be doing that, and take advantage of it if you get to some really serious legal problem. Here's a question that's been submitted. Can observers talk with runners? What observers can do for runners, and this is their get out the vote aspect as opposed to their voter protection aspect, is observers can perhaps very quietly say, here's the list of people who voted so far. That's basically one thing observers do. They mark on their voter rolls who has voted. They can give to the runners. They can't just have conversations. They're supposed to sit quietly, but they might be able to say, hi, here's the list. But they can't really have conversations with runners, but they can certainly give the runners the list of people who have voted. I meant to go back to look at this chart again and sort of review some of the tactics with respect to this chart. So, and show you how these tactics relate to this chart. So the first one, educate the voters. That strengthens this lower, the polling place and the voters there at the polling place. Nominating good BOE members and judges strengthens the election officials up in the upper right corner. Makes them makes sure that they are responsible. Working with the local officials, that means that's the relationship between the county chair and the director of elections. That strengthens that relationship, that top side of the triangle. The poll observers and the greeters that monitor inside and outside strengthen the polling place in terms of voter protection, and they also strengthen the county chair. If you think about the fact that if you have greeters at every precinct polling place, and the greeters can be in touch with the county chair, it makes the county chair a much stronger person for the party in terms of protecting the vote on election day, because in effect, the county chair has eyes and ears at every polling place in the county. So the observers and the greeters also strengthen that that left-hand counter, and that communication path. The more greeters and observers you have, the more bandwidth you have on that particular communication path. So just relating those tactics back to the another question is, what if a polling place does not allow greeters? I have never heard of such a thing. I'm not saying it can't possibly happen. Some people are now telling me that churches may not allow greeters. In that case, if they're not allowed, you might want to talk to your board of elections and see if there's some fix for that. Or you might want to, greeters have to be outside the 50-foot boundary. I'm now being told some churches don't allow them anywhere, which could be a problem. I would guess if it's not allowed on the church property, then they would have to be outside the church property. Surely they're not prohibited from being outside the church property on the public sidewalk or something. But check with your board of elections about that and your director of elections to see whether or not any workarounds can be established for that. So on to, besides tactics, there are also some strategic things that can be done. One of the most important ones is to promote early voting. Make it a part of your GOTV campaign that they promote early voting. And the reason for this is fairly simple. If you vote early, you're not going to get stuck on election day in some place where the lines are too long and you end up not being able to vote. Also on election day or on early voting, voting out a precinct is not an issue. Anybody can vote at any early voting site. Also, if there's any sort of problem, there is time and opportunity to address that problem. You may have to return bringing some sort of document if that was the problem that a voter encountered. Secondly, incorporate your voter protection activities into other party activities. For example, voter education as a tactic. You can include that into your standard voter education program. So if you're putting out, for example, a voter guide, include in the voter guide things about voting rights and what to do if a problem occurs. If you have a voter registration drive, you can include in that voter registration drive, you can have a poster on the table of the voting rights. So educate voters through voter registration. GOTV, you can do voter education when you have canvassing or phone banking. You can include information about voter protection. So, for example, if this voter ID constitutional amendment passes and then survives the inevitable court challenge, in your phone banking, you might include a little note to the part of the script that would say, be sure to bring your voter ID. So you can include voter protection and GOTV. We've already talked about how the greeter program, if you've had that without voter protection, it's relatively simple to include voter protection in your greeter activities. You need to include voter protection training in your greeter training, and then set up your your problem response team or the county chair. So there are a number of ways that you can incorporate voter protection into other party activities. You can see the planning guide that accompanies this thing for other suggestions about that. Share the load between the county and the precincts. The county can't do it all, and the precincts are on the ground on election day at their polling places. So the general rule of thumb about sharing that load is have the county party organize the greeter program and the voter protection during the early voting period. Have the precincts organize the voter protection activities, which would be the greeter program and the greeters. In any case, they're going to share the problem response team between the county and the precincts. The training is probably best done by the county. You don't want each precinct to have to prepare training materials. So let the county take care of the training and the problem response team. The precincts basically are doing the greeting and the observing and reporting on election day at their polling places. You can coordinate to some extent with other groups, with churches, with student groups, with indivisible groups, with the resistance. You can share your voter education information, for example, with them. The voting rights handout. You can try to encourage them to promote early voting and share any other sort of activities that might relate to voter protection with them. And lastly, heighten the focus on election day. Voters don't get another chance after election day. Lines tend to be longer. Dirty tricks, I think, are more likely on election day. There's no same-day registration on election day, so you need to heighten the focus. That means deploy your observers and greeters, especially on election day. Respond promptly to problems. Make sure your problem response team has sufficient legal backup, and then act quickly. Here's some, looks like sort of boilerplate project management, corporate style boilerplate about project management, but I'm going to try to give it a focus for voter protection. Establish realistic goals, that's always important, but what should you think about for realistic goals for your county? One item is, how big is the need? Has your county actually had problems in the past? And therefore, I think probably there's more interest in your county party for voter protections if there have been voter irregularities, intimidation, or misinformation in the past. Another item is, how many volunteers are you going to need to accomplish your goals, and how many are available? And the last major item to think about is your precinct organizations and the strength of those, because they are probably going to be the organizations responsible on election day. So if you are a well-organized county and have 80% of your precincts organized, you can establish more ambitious goals. If you have 20% of your precincts organized, you have to be more realistic about what you will actually be able to do on election day. So those are some considerations. Secondly, develop a written plan. You plan because you don't want to get most of the way along in your development of your program and suddenly realize you left out some critical part. And you also can use a written plan for communication. You can use your voter protection plan to coordinate that plan with your other party activities, like your GOTV or your phone banking and canvassing, voter registration, and so on. Lastly, build consensus for the goals, and you can do that, for example, at a CEC meeting. Devote a CEC meeting to voter protection. Talk about the need for it, the goals of your plan, the benefits of your plan, what your plan actually is, and build consensus in the CEC for the program. And build consensus with the precincts. Now, the precinct chairs will be at the CEC or typically or part of the CEC, but the precincts have that important role on election day to play. So they need to be in the consensus about what's going to happen. And lastly, you can build consensus with your party volunteers just through your normal party communications, your newsletter, or your website. On your website, you might put a bullet up that shows what you plan to do about voter protection, and also put up a copy of the North Carolina Voters Bill of Rights. I would suggest, as far as realistic goals go, that it is better to have a successful program than to overcommit yourself, because you don't want later on people saying, well, that didn't work, we're not going to do that again. What you want is to start with a small, realistic plan if you've never done it before, and make it a success, and then you can build on that. I know in Orange County, when we started our greeter program many, many years ago, we started small, and then over time, we were able to organize more and more of our precincts and get more and more of our precincts to have greeter programs. So start with a small, successful program as opposed to a program that overcommits you and you may not be very successful and leave a bad taste in your mouth. So let's consider what some of those goals might be. Educating voters would be one, and here's some ideas about how to do that. Copy the handout, the North Carolina Voters Bill of Rights, from the Democracy North Carolina website, and make 10,000 copies of it and distribute it. Have it in the literature that you distribute when you do canvassing, when you have rallies, when you have tables anywhere. Have it on your greeter tables and pass it out to voters as they enter the polling place so they can see what their rights are. You can have a poster at each voter registration table and each greeter's table. You can have a link on your website to a list of voting rights. You can include voting rights information in your electronic communication. You can share your voting rights information with electoral allies, and you should always include in this information about how they can assert their rights and report problems. Another goal to consider is poll observers on election day. If you've already used observers, then you're well on your way. You have to ensure that these poll observers are trained about how they behave inside the polling place and how to report any problems if they are able to do that. You might, if you've never used poll observers actually inside the polling places, you could think of appointing your 10 free-range observers that you're now used and have them go around from polling place to polling place throughout the course of election day to do that. Use greeters for early voting and election day. Greeters are, I think, a really important program because not only do you get to give the voter a sample ballot, you can also observe problems and report. The question that you have to consider in all of these goals is what level of coverage can you provide, particularly for poll observers and for greeters. So the level of coverage you can provide, you might want to, for example, during early voting, if you don't have enough volunteers, or you don't have a surplus of volunteers, you may have enough volunteers to cover your high volume early voting sites. Or you may be able to cover all early voting sites, but only during the busy period. So that would be in the morning before work, at lunchtime, and after work. You could perhaps be able to support a greeter table at those periods. Similarly, on election day, how many precincts can you support with a greeter table? It may be that you need to start just with your well-organized precincts and have them have a greeter table. And even there, they may need to have their greeters present at the busiest times if they can't cover the entire day. And then lastly, if you're doing any of these other things, particularly if you have observers and greeters, you need to establish a problem response team, and that can be just as simple as giving the greeters the phone number of the cell phone number of the county chair so that the county chair can field the problems and call the director of elections to get it resolved. The plan, we've talked about a number of these elements. This is just sort of a list. I'm not going to talk about all of them at all, just a few, in fact. As far as on the third bullet there, the volunteers, you need to say how many are needed, what their tasks will be, what the duration of a term of service. Like, for example, a greeter, typically in Orange County, we have a 2-hour time slot for a greeter. So do the planning so that the greeters know how long they're going to have to work. Include information about how you plan to recruit them and how you plan to schedule them. The materials you need to think about are what materials do you need to vote for voter education? The handouts you need, the posters, any articles that you might write for your communications. The materials for the greeter tables you need to also understand. So that would be the table and chairs, the sample ballots, any sort of literature that you want to have there. And then the training, you need to train your observers and your greeters, and you need to have that as part of the plan. I will say, as far as greeter training goes, the county-to-county program that's bringing you this voter protection webinar also has materials and greeter training webinars available for training of greeters. On to a little more organizing. Need to appoint a voter protection coordinator. It ought not to be the county chair. The county chair has plenty of other things to do, including probably being a part of the problem response team. You also need to have some people with that voter protection coordinator. Nobody can do it by him or herself. 2 or 3 people are sufficient for the planning purposes. You may need to add more during the operational phase of voter protection. The first job of this voter protection coordinator and team is to develop the plan and build the consensus. Then we've talked about already how you need to work with your precincts, share the load, but you need to cooperate fully. If you think about what the party's doing on at the early voting sites. They're setting up a greeter table. They're observing for problems. They're reporting those problems. They're passing out sample ballots and voter guides and lists of voting rights and so on. That's exactly the same thing that the precincts do on election day. So there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration. So here's some things that need to be shared. The plans need to be shared. That's part of building your consensus. Precincts need to share their election day plans with the overall voter protection coordinator. So if a precinct says, we're going to have a greeter table, we're going to be able to report to the problem response team. So precincts need to share their plans. Information that's generated for the early voting site coordinators, the people that manage the setup and takedown of the table, of the greeter table, and so on. There's information that's generated for those coordinators. That information needs to be shared with the people that are doing the same job, the greeter table coordinator, the site coordinator for the precincts. Any written materials such as sample ballots, voter guides, handouts that get developed for early voting should also be made available for precincts for their use on election day. Training materials should be shared. The problem response team should be shared. That's at the county level. Volunteers can be shared. A lot of times the county party is more successful than the precincts are, or they have access to more volunteers. So if a county party says, we can't cover all of the hours on election day, do you have some surplus volunteers? The county party may well have some and can share those volunteers with the precincts. This is a timeline. It begins a year before the election. For this 2018 election, we're already halfway through this timeline, which brings us to 2 months before early voting and election day. But let's begin back at the beginning. What can you do in January after the 2018 election? The first thing to do is to build your party infrastructure. That's your leadership capability, your precinct organizations, your reliable volunteers, your communication capabilities. Build your party infrastructure so that it will be robust by the time you get to the election and your voter protection program becomes active. Secondly, review your Board of Election plans with the director of the Board of Director of Elections. So that could be in January. What you could talk about is this past election. Were there any problems with the voting on the last election? Were some of the polling places inadequate for one reason or another? Were there some or poorly trained poll workers? Maybe some that were even perhaps malevolent and failed to assist voters, which is part of their job. Review what happened this past election with the Director of Elections, and then talk about the specific needs for the next election. So review those plans, and you can do that more than one time. You don't just do it a year in advance. You do it a year in advance, and you may check again in the spring before the primary, and you may check again in the early summer about the plans for the fall election to make sure that there aren't any loose ends hanging out. You should appoint your protection coordinator pretty soon to allow that plan to get developed and the consensus to be built. So you can start right after this election with these items in this first box here. Then 4 months before early voting starts or 4 months before election day, recruit those volunteers that you're going to need. You should start with the site coordinators and trainers. They have more to do. They have a bigger task. It's going to take them longer to do it. Then you can recruit the greeters and the other volunteers like greeters and observers later. Prepare the training materials, review the plan. It's unlikely that your plan will be perfect the first time, but more power to you if it is. Then 4 months before early voting, 4 weeks, sorry, acquire the materials you need for your for your greeter tables and for your educating the voter program. In fact, your educating the voter program can start well in advance of the election. Train the volunteers in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Review the plan again. Then during early voting, deploy the volunteers. Monitor the voting, address those problems. On election day, deploy the volunteer, monitor the voting, address any problems. Observe the vote count. The last observer in the polling place can observe the count, or the county chair can drop in some places and observe the count. After election day, observe the recount. Thank the volunteers and review the program. Now, let's think about where we really are. This is a timeline aimed, so it gives you plenty of time aimed at the next election. But we are not at that place. We are back before, we're at 2 months before early voting and election day. Think about what you can do. What I would say is think about your current activities that you already have planned and how you can incorporate voter protection aspects into your other planned programs. So for example, if you're doing a GOTV program, you can use that for voter education about voting rights and to promote early voting. If you already have a voter education program, such as a voter guide in preparation that you're going to hand out, or other literature that you're going to use to educate voters, make sure you include in that a list of voting rights and what they can do if those voting rights are infringed on election day. If you have a greeter program, you are in really good shape, because all you need to do there is include an extra 6 minutes of training on voter protection for your greeters, and then put your county chair in place to receive calls if problems are observed. You might want to, so my first suggestion, since we are now at the end of August, is do what you can to incorporate early voting aspects into existing programs. If you also have some well-organized precincts that have not had a voter protection program, but they want to do a little pilot program, more power to them. Do what you can to help them get a greeter program put together at the state, and train the greeters and have the county chair available to to handle problems. So here we are after election day. Thank you. Any questions? See the Planning for Voter Protection document. It's a supplement to this presentation for detailed description of many of the ideas presented. I will also say there is a similar companion document to poll greeting, organizing for poll greeting. So if you want to get a hold of the Planning for Poll Greeting document, send a note to in another chart or two. There'll be an email address. You can request the Planning for Poll Greeting document. But we would like your feedback. Please type into the chat room what worked for you today, what can be improved, and thank you for your attendance and for any of the feedback that you can provide us. If you want more county to county info, or if you have questions, you can contact Julie Tomkovic or Jenny McMillan about the trainings, and there's the website. You can also use that to request the Planning for Poll Greeting document. We are still open for questions. If you want to keep going here and type some more questions into the chat box, I'm here for as long as questions keep. Oh, now this is an interesting question because I have the fun answer. What do you view as the greatest threat to voting in North Carolina? My answer is the North Carolina General Assembly, dominated by Republicans who are doing all they can to suppress the vote. Now, if I think about it, besides that quick answer, I would say The voter ID amendment that's going to be on the ballot is a very big threat. And the other matters that I fully expect the General Assembly to implement once they get control of the Board of Elections, the State Board of Elections, with their power to appoint the 8 members of that board, they will be able to do more or less whatever they want to do to entrench themselves into a permanent control of the powers of government by controlling the electoral process. I'm actually quite worried about our democracy, and we need to be alert about this. Do I have anything to say about voting equipment's types and failures? And the answer is I do not. I don't know much about voting equipment. Your director, you might want to take that up with your director of elections, whose job it is to select that equipment and make sure it's maintained. You might want to talk to your Board of Elections about that as well to find out and your county commissioners to see if they have been appropriating funds over the years to maintain the voting equipment and to purchase new voting equipment if the equipment that we have is getting old. I will say in North Carolina, we are blessed to have a pretty good voting system in the sense that we use paper ballots. Paper ballots allows an audit trail, and in fact, county boards of elections and the director of elections are required to do an audit for the election, which means they count the ballot, they choose some sample precincts, they count them by hand, the paper ballots, they run them through the voting machine, the voter counting machine, and if there's any discrepancy at all, even if it's only one vote off, they then have to do a full countywide recount of the paper ballots. So that's one thing that we have right in North Carolina, our paper ballots. Any other questions? How do you respond to problems with voter rolls? That can be, that's a reason. There are several things you can do there. One is vote no on all those constitutional amendments. One of those constitutional amendments requires county parties, I think it's the same one that has to do with the state board being appointed by the General Assembly. They are going to require county directors of elections or boards of elections to report about their list maintenance procedures. And my suspicion is that that's going to lead to some purge rules and regulations that are not going to be helpful coming out of the State Board of Elections, or maybe even some legislation by the General Assembly about how your voter rolls need to be purged. So one thing to do is talk to your director of elections as to what they do about the voter rolls. Talk to your Board of Election members about what the rules and regulations are. If a voter has a problem and it is told that, oh, you're not on the list, that voter always has the right to demand a provisional ballot. And as soon as the BOE determines that that voter really is a legitimate voter in the county, that ballot will be counted. Otherwise, you might want to talk to your legislators or your county commissioners about problems with voter rolls and what needs to be done about those. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Julie again, and I just want to echo what Jack said. We thank you for joining us this evening. Please continue to give us any feedback. that you have on what worked for you this evening, or what we might be able to improve in the future. And we're all a part of, there's a short game and a long game. And the short game is to see what we can do in 2018. The longer game continues on to 2020, and to make sure we train all of our voters to get in the habit of voting every 2 years instead of every 4 years, and occasionally every year if you have municipal elections. So every opportunity that they can vote, we need our people to vote. But what you're engaging in this evening is such an important aspect of making elections work in North Carolina and across the country. So again, thank you for joining us this evening. We have just begun to get our recordings online, and everyone who has attended this evening or even signed up for the webinar will get an invitation and a link to where the recording will be once all of those are fully uploaded. We expect that to be within the next couple of weeks. We've got the first 6 are up, and so we're doing a little testing, and once we're sure that that's a go, you can expect to hear from us again. It will be a bit of a private room setting, so even though these will be located on YouTube, it will be in a private room, and we expect people will treat the links that they're given accordingly. But thank you, and we will see you in November. Thanks.